All right, welcome, Trevor.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. We met through a mutual friend.
Yep.
And we had a conversation on the phone just talking about potentially doing the podcast. And we ended up talking for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
I think we speak the same language a little
Yeah,
bit. We have similar but different life experiences. And I think what you do is so important and so fascinating. And I know that the topic of sobriety seems more relevant year after year. I don't know how it is in your industry, but just from the feedback that I get from my audience, it seems like more people are struggling or more people are being honest about their struggles.
Yeah.
And I think also sobriety is kind of having a moment in some places.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about all of that, but why don't you tell the audience a little bit about what it is that you do?
I'll self-disclose. I am in recovery myself. I hope you don't hold it against me, but I used to work on Wall Street. I have an MBA. I'm
also
actually
recovering Wall Street person.
Yeah, exactly. And things look great on paper. Underneath all that, there's a lot of trauma in childhood, things growing up in the household. And so from a young age, I sort of always felt a little bit low self-esteem and sometimes anxiety, depression, but put these masks on to try and protect me from feeling so vulnerable in the world. And so I think it was Einstein who said, we all ask ourselves at some point if the world is safe, whether we do it, whether aware consciously or subconsciously. And I knew from a young age, or I felt it wasn't. And so what happened, I lived in the city for a long time. When I was 29, I was actually at the World Trade Center when 9/11 happened. So it was another big T trauma for me that reinforced that the world's not safe. And I was what you call very high functioning, I guess, on the outside, but inside, it was not cool. Mm-hmm. And so I was lucky I had some people, essentially kind of intervene on me and in my early 30s, and it was a huge moment for me where life really shifted in a meaningful way. I got very engaged in different modalities and therapy and whatnot, and wound up finding this whole new blueprint on how to live life, which has been amazing for me. So much so that in getting to sort of what I do, a few years into that, had this sort of existential moment of, what am I going to do with my life? I was really unhappy. Working on Wall Street, it was sort of a square peg in a round hole feeling, and I loved helping people, and I found, the last place I thought I'd find peace of mind is in essentially being of service to other people, and I found that very rewarding. So I decided to go back to school. I didn't know if I was going to try and become a clinician, hang up a shingle in Manhattan. One thing led to another. I became a certified interventionist and started doing what's called clinical intensive case management. And all those masks, the 9/11 survivor, the ex-athlete, the NBA Wall Street guy, all those things that I had to take off to get back to my authentic self, actually had a silver lining in that when I got into the industry, I guess I was sort of a unicorn in with my background. So I got a lot of really cool opportunities. And fast forward to today, I was in the field for a while, partners with different people. I had sort of my own vision of how I wanted to do things. Back in 2016, I left a partnership and started my own company called Sterling Recovery. And we don't advertise or market ourselves. It's all referrals, but we work a lot in many different facets. But I think what I'm known for is an interventionist. I don't love the word interventionist because of the associations people have with it on TV, all the drama. Mm-hmm. What I find interesting is, the average person who struggles with addiction, mental health issues, and we do all sorts of interventions, actually has a higher IQ than the average person who doesn't. It has nothing to do with how intelligent we may or may not be.
Yeah.
But we tend to be a little bit sensitive and find these maladaptive coping mechanisms which get us into trouble over time. And so, for me, what I found is intervening is really just helping raise someone's bottom without them having to go all the way downhill and getting them on the right track. And then we do a lot of work with ongoing care and helping people through their recovery process, whether it's mental health, substance abuse, eating disorders or whatnot. And I do a lot of work with different companies. So ironically, companies I worked at sometimes hire me now, which is kind of funny because if they knew what was going on back then, they might not, but that's well in the past, thank God. And so that's kind of what we do in a nutshell.
I think it's probably helpful for at least one person listening to hear that you are high functioning. because I think one of the common misconceptions or stigmas around addiction, alcoholism, whatever you want to call it, is that somebody, is homeless or jobless or whatever the case may be. And I've always been really open on my show about my bottom. I was a really low bottom. And I'm so grateful for that because, we have a saying, gift of desperation. I had the gift of desperation. I had nowhere else to go except for the path that I went. And so therefore I was willing to take it. But I think what a lot of people struggle with is feeling like, well, I have a job, I have money in the bank, I have a partner, they have kids, whatever it is. And it's just the behavior, and it might be kind of the emotional bankruptcy or the spiritual bankruptcy that's gnawing at them. I always admire people who get help and get sober when they're in that position. Because that seems so much harder. So how do you work with people like that? And can I just say, you're kind of like a celebrity interventionist, right? The guy that introduced us said you're the guy that they call when somebody in, entertainment is in trouble. And I would imagine that you don't have to speak to anybody specifically, and I can edit this out if you want, but those are often really high functioning people too. And yet we know there's so many celebrities in the public eye who not only struggle, but, die from this disease. So how do you go about raising somebody's bottom and working with somebody like that?
So it's tricky. Every case is a little bit different. Sometimes what I find, and I don't think there's any maliciousness to it, but when you look at someone who needs to be intervened on, I look at, it's a little bit of a crass term, but like, who are the stakeholders? Is it family members? Is it their agent? Is it, whoever it might be? And getting everybody on board is important. And there can be, in a way, like a subconscious attachment to someone not being completely well, because you can feel like, you can control them better, right? Especially some of the celebrities that have big personalities. So
I remember learning, not to interrupt, but something about the family dynamic is to maintain the status quo, even if the status quo is dysfunctional.
100%. Yeah. So, there's a saying I've heard that, people who struggle with addiction like to go to the source of pain looking for comfort. And that can not just be whatever, a drink or a drug or food or gambling or sex addiction, but, relationships and exactly what you're talking about. So to me, like, it's important how I define a bottom, because you'll hear many different ways of viewing that, is when the notion of continuing on life the way you've been living seems more daunting than any other way. Like, so when I say raise someone's bottom, I think someone needs to fully, whether they're, down and out and homeless, or, have resources to be able to, mask a lot of what's going on. For me, it was internally, like, I don't want to overshare, but like, there were times where if I was walking on the street and a bus hit me, worse things could happen. Like, I was in a bad place emotionally. You might not think so, just looking at me from the outside. And so oftentimes I'll bring in, people who they really respect, who they like, who are really concerned, and bring in a very loving, I don't believe in shaming or blaming, but in a very loving way. It's the most effective way to open someone's heart to understand that it's time to try things a little bit differently. And I've never done an intervention where I haven't needed a box of Kleenex. Like, it's very emotional, and it's very rewarding in that awareness, things that we've been stuffing down, dissociating from, and coming from a place where not only are we going to essentially petition them to get help, but really present an amazing solution. Because when you're in that spot, let's just take, if you're an alcoholic, like if you felt the way I felt, you would drink like I do too. If you've been through my, like that kind of notion goes on. And so the thought of living life without that ability to anesthetize, the alcohol, the drug, whatever that coping mechanism is really a manifestation of what's going on underneath. I come from a very trauma-centric, underneath, and anything along the mental health spectrum, from, anxiety, depression, all the way through personality disorders, antisocial personality disorders, you name it. But the drinking or the drugging, in that case, it's really just a manifestation. So when you start addressing what's going on underneath and it resonates with them, a light bulb can go off, and that's when the magic starts to happen. So not everyone needs to wind up in, as they say, jails, institution, or God forbid, death, you know, and that's why I love what I do.
Yeah, I would imagine that there has to be so much finesse involved.
Yeah.
Because, you know, to your point, that's somebody's coping mechanism. And I hear so many people in recovery say, you know, thank God I was an alcoholic because it kept me alive long enough, you know, to deal with they weren't dealing with it. They were numbing whatever was driving the behavior. And then in sobriety, they were able to address that. But, you know, people say, and trigger warning, everybody, that their addiction or their alcoholism kept them from killing themselves. And I just know from my own experience, like when I took my first drink when I was 16, 17, I don't remember, instantly it was my solution to life. All of the things that I had been feeling, the discomfort, the noise in my head, the less than, the you're thinking this, and all of that went away. And that continued to be my solution for 10 years. And so anybody who tried to come between me and that was like enemy number one. And, you know, I was ultimately intervened on, but I think I told you about that experience. They didn't even really have to do much because they got to my door, I opened the door, and I dropped and had a grand mal seizure. So that was the intervention. And then it was like, okay, you're like, and I always say, like, I was struck sober in that moment, I think, because from that point on, like, I haven't, thank God, had the desire to drink or use. But then I found, you know, like you said, a design for living that has helped me continue that. But I would imagine it's just so high stress. So how do you plan for an intervention? Do you go in with a plan of like, okay, we're going to get on the plane. We have tickets. You don't want to give them any lag time. You have rehabs chosen. Is their family prepared leading up to this? What does that look like?
So that's a great question. I'll do my best to answer because, like I said, every case is a little bit different. And there's an overused term like, you know, we want to meet someone where they're at, right? And so also, you know, we want to have a desired outcome, you know, so because if some people, I think, will come to me and they say, oh, we intervened on, you know, our loved one or dad or son or whatnot, daughter. And so if I were to go and approach someone and address them without a solution, they might, you know, by the way, like to what you said, we're unbelievable manipulators when we're in our addiction. I hate the phrase, you know, how do you tell when an alcoholic or an addict is lying, like their mouth is moving, but like there's some truth to that because we're so hyper vigilant. I mean, that's really what got to me too, was the you know, I got involved with alcohol and drugs too, and I used the drugs to balance out some of the drinking, you know, and so, you know, it's exhausting, you know, and so by default, like, you know, we're living at least a double life, if not a triple or quadruple life, you know, and we have to keep everything straight. Plus, you know, we're not straight, you know, and so it can be really, really overwhelming. So having a good plan in place, you know, there are so many different treatment centers in the U.S. Last I heard, there's over 14,000 different options in the U.S., which is kind of absurd. Wow. And of that, you know, there's about 50 or so, and I'm sure there's more of that I really like. And I'm being in the field long enough, and I have amazing colleagues. Like, I keep my world kind of small, but there, you know, I feel like in some ways Wall Street followed me into the industry, and now you see all these companies popping up, and, you know, so I kind of try and keep things a little bit simple with that, and go with, you know, whoever's got good, you know, outcomes and efficacy. But actually, I lost what your question was, you know, as far as
the preparation.
With
the family and on your end going into the
for sure. Sorry, I digressed a little bit. Okay. So oftentimes I do use letters. The reason why I use letters is because this is extremely emotional. And if someone initially is a little combative, they're going to want to create chaos, right? So they're going to be like, you know, you're here for me. What about you? And, you know, and so everyone's really, really well coached. We do a bunch of meetings. there's like, I don't like kind of come in on my high horse, pick someone up on my back and take them out. Like there's so much planning that goes into an intervention, and get, meetings in person or Zooms, and then always doing what I call a rehearsal, either, usually the day before we're up close to it. The letters that I use, they're usually broken down into 3 parts. And the most important part, let's say they're on average about 2 pages, is the first part, which is the majority of the letter. It's everything you love about the person, and one is we want to disarm them because they might be a little defensive, and 2, we want to remind them who they really are, where they might have gotten lost along the way. The second part of the letter is more of what I call the however things haven't been this way for some time, and then without shaming or blaming, but like putting things, and most importantly, like how it makes me feel, like when you, very generic, when you drive drunk or while intoxicated, it terrifies me, the thought of you hurting someone or yourself or wanting, and so we're in a very loving way bringing that to the surface, and then we've brought in a professional here to help us figure out a solution, and we leave it vague. So everyone's really well coached. Everyone knows to defer to me. We want to eliminate chaos. We want to eliminate egos getting in the way, and everyone's coming from a lot of fear. So there's a lot of prep work, making sure that everyone is as comfortable as possible, because when you're in that space and you're getting intervened on, you're very aware of you're feeling everything. And so
I had a little bit of that when you were saying how the letter is kind of broken down, because I remember that not from my intervention but from like parents' weeks at all the various rehabs that I went to, where my brother and my parents would come and read very similar things like that, and the shame. And it's not meant to shame.
No.
But the shame that an addict or alcoholic, afflicted individual, whatever you want to call it, whatever they're dealing with, is so overwhelming. And I think that perpetuates the cycle of the drinking and the using. So
recovery, it's in and of itself, for me, like I was constantly living in outcomes and results, like even like in my own way, people pleasing, making sure that everything was okay. And shame, I learned early on that shame is like, guilt is feeling bad about something specifically that I may have done. Shame is feeling bad about who I am as a person. And like the shame, I've never met anyone who's come into recovery who isn't riddled with shame, and it's the worst. And so, going back to the source of pain, looking for comfort, if I'm, triggered, usually it's like my shame button's getting pushed, and I just want to quiet it down. And so you're absolutely right. There's it's really important to come from a place of compassion. One of my teachers, when I went back to school, used the term, instead of confrontation, carefrontation, and that really struck out. Dr. Harris Drayton, that really resonated with me. And so that to me is the approach I try and take. And my outcomes, and I think the reason why I get these high profile, the Wall Street CEOs, I mean, we work with everyone, don't get me wrong, but, and celebrities is we have very good outcomes and results because we're coming from the right place, and we're coming from a place of integrity, and we're really, I think the person feels that very much in their heart. And someone who, like to your earlier question, like who can be challenging and very enabled just based on who they are and what they do, feels that, and they feel that sincerity, and they yearn for that. And so a light usually will go on, and they're willing to kind of take my hand and come with me, and so it's super rewarding. It's very cool when you see that happen, as I'm sure you know. Yeah.
Do you self-disclose? Because I would imagine that a lot of people who are in the position of being intervened on have some of those stigmas, misconceptions, whatever in there. And I mean, I know from experience, one alcoholic or addict talking to another can help to kind of overcome that. So
for sure.
Do you self-disclose in that moment, or do you wait, or do you not at all?
No, I actually often do, because, I'm working with, my niche has seemed to be, based on my background, like high functioning either individuals or families with someone who's, not maybe potentially high functioning, but the family seems to be in that space. And so, we're taught in school not to self-disclose, but I if someone's going to judge me for that, then that's on them, you know, and because exactly to what you said, like, when someone's in that space and, that was the one thing, it was the solution was in this case, drinking or whatever it is that you're doing, life seems over. Like, like I identified exactly with what you said. Like when I put that in my system, like all the noise went down. I had a sense of belonging. Like I could socialize a little bit. I mean, it started off really with good intentions, and then consequences start building. And obviously, I'm here and you're here for a reason. So it didn't work out so well in the end.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do often do that because I also have a lot of time in recovery now, and it's hopefully I'm seen as someone who is living life to the fullest, maybe a power of example, and something that's attractive, as opposed to thinking it's going to be awful.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it at that, and you fill in whatever that cartoon looks like.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why I talk about it too. I mean, I think on the one hand, it would be so dishonest of me to share about the triumphs and the challenges of my life without talking about sobriety, which is the absolute foundation that my life is built upon. But also, like 10 years ago when I got sober, I didn't know of any women who were living a life that seemed attractive to me who were sober. First of all, I didn't know where to go to find them. But, there wasn't really social media back then, or social media was like just starting. Yeah. But I thought that getting sober was the end of my life, and that it was going to be so boring. Not that drinking and using was very much fun at the end there either. Drinking alone, drinking in the morning, having seizures, rinse, repeat. I mean, but I think it's important to, whatever any individual is comfortable with, but I think it's important to show that, sobriety can not only be fun, it's so fulfilling. And I think it's like a superpower. That's just
that's so funny. And it is. And I'm so glad that you feel comfortable disclosing and being, a power of example. But you'd be amazed. Maybe you wouldn't be amazed, but who steps foot in front of my office or whose homes I've been in. Like I once heard the term, it's an equal opportunity destroyer, right? So, the stigma has definitely come down quite a bit over the years. It's like some people think it's cool. A lot of people think it's cool, and people are, sober curious and doing like different things like that, which to me is amazing. And it's interesting when I'm like, if I'm at a dinner and I'm not disclosing, just a regular dinner and would you like some wine or a wedding? I'm like, no, I don't drink. People like almost admire that, like, oh, you don't drink? What? It's like, nah, I'm good, know. And
I think that's so important for people to hear, because I have a lot of young female listeners, some males too, who are wanting to explore sobriety, but they're so afraid of being judged by their friend group or their coworkers or whoever it is if they're not drinking when they go out. And some of them send me messages and say, I went out and my friends were pressuring me. And so I think every situation is different, because like you, I don't think anybody has ever asked me why I'm not drinking. And I don't know if that's just who I'm around or what, but I think that there is this fear of judgment. So let's talk about, like, maybe not the full-blown alcoholic or addict. If somebody is starting to feel like maybe it's not serving them, but they're not sure if they have a problem or not, what would be your recommendation for them?
So that's interesting, because if you have there's, I'll call it controversy between, is this a disease or not a disease? I mean, no one when they're 5 years old, raises their hand and says, hey, guess what, mom, dad, I can't wait to have issues and have you worried about me, whatever it is. But I think it's really important. I know for me, there are many lines in the sand that I didn't think I'd ever cross that I wound up doing, like places I wound up, or, who I was hanging out with and all that kind of stuff. And so I think it's really important when you are clear-headed in that space to like say, okay, what would indicate that I have an issue or not? And then to say, like, commit to something, like for the next 30 or 90 days, I'm not drinking. And how challenging is that for you? I think when you if it becomes very problematic, like we said, it's a coping mechanism. So if when stressors happen, when things happen, you kind of get a sense of like, I need a drink. Or if you do have a drink, how far down the rabbit hole do you go? Or if you commit to say like, I'll have 2 or 3 drinks 2 nights a week and that's it, and you just can't do that, chances are it's problematic, and you might want to look into like what's going on underneath. There's 2 sort of macro levels of looking at. There's sort of the abstinent-based model of like just not drinking or drugging or anything at all, and then there's what's called the harm reduction. Now, I know for me, when I was active in my addiction, if you presented something where I could drink like a gentleman, whatever that means, like I'm going for that. But I also know like I probably would have personally struggled with that.
It's like the saying, if you're controlling, what is it? If I'm enjoying my drinking, I'm not controlling it. And if I'm controlling my drinking, I'm not enjoying it.
Exactly. So yeah, looking at it from that lens, and just, being true to yourself. I'm not a cookie cutter type of person, and I don't want anyone to feel like, well, if I'm concerned, does that mean that I'm going to be judged or forced down? You really have to figure it out for yourself. And a lot of it's self-reflection. Like I said, it's what makes me have issues with addiction isn't the substance itself, it's how I think when I'm not using the substance, right? So like a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of like self-consciousness, and like you mentioned, the noise in my head that can get pretty uncomfortable and loud, where I want to just quiet it down. Like, what's the next painkiller? It could be food, it could be anything. And so how do I how am I aware of that? And then what to do with that? Because it is a big decision, and that thought of having to be the caricature of like someone being homeless with a brown bag, having to be what an alcoholic is such a misnomer. I mean, it's unbelievable, So obviously that exists, but that's not what, that doesn't need to be what you need to hit in order to decide to make a change.
Yeah. There were a few things that I liked that you said. Definitely the lines in the sand. Yeah. I crossed all of those. I kept drawing new ones and then crossing them. And it just made me think of your actions not aligning with your values. Yeah. I think that's something to pay attention to. And
I love that. That's a great, I might steal that from you.
Yeah. I probably heard it somewhere else. Yeah. I think another one is like, once you start, can you stop? Because I know for myself, I could never tell you. There were nights where I could drink 2 glasses of wine at dinner like a lady and go home, and that was it. Yeah. And that's what was kind of insidious, because I would go through these phases where I was like, oh yeah, I'm like, I got this. Inevitably, there's that night where I start and I say, I'm going to have 1 drink and go home at 11, and it's 3 days later and I'm like in a different state, you know, like safely predict like when or how I was going to stop and where it was going to take me.
Yeah, and that's what's so tricky about it. It's like, well, if I was at a work event or, there were sort of guardrails around me, I was fine, But if you can't predict, what you said, when that time is going to happen, where, 3 days later, or chaos, or you're blacked out and you're like, what did I do? You have to look at your phone to see what you and retrace, it's a horrible feeling. And so, that is probably a good indicator that there might be an issue. And I think just redefining, many things when I got into recovery, I had to redefine like words in particular that I had issues with. And so, first starting with what does it mean? It's really just the inability to, in this case, if you're talking drinking, like drink safe without there being consequences that may or may not, come. But it's something that only, I know this, only, no matter how I approach someone or, only I can decide for myself. Only you can decide for yourself. But it certainly doesn't hurt to have people who really care about you approach you and hopefully in a loving way kind of put a little bit of a mirror out there, knowing that, there's another way to go about this,
Yeah, that's a good segue, because that was kind of my next question. I also get a lot of messages from people who have loved ones who are struggling, whether they are married and they're kind of in and out of rehab, or they haven't accepted help yet, or they are now maybe in a program and they're trying to get sober and getting help, and the partner wants to know how to best support them. What is your advice?
Yeah, I mean, each case is a little bit different. There are wonderful self-help like programs out there. A lot of people like the program Al-Anon, which is sort of a sister program of Alcoholics Anonymous, but because oftentimes you'll hear the word codependency used, right? And codependency, I mean, we think of it in terms of like words usually come to mind when if I ask like someone who's engaging with me, like, what does codependent mean to you? And they'll say like enabling, or, which is true. But if you're a codependent, it's almost like clinically, like, if you think of like a pilot and a co-pilot, like the person who has the issue being the pilot, whether you're enabling or not, you're the codependent. You're in relationship with that person. And so how do you learn to navigate through that? So I think, seeking professional advice, whether it's through someone like me or finding, a therapist who's either specializes or certainly is well-versed in addiction, things along those lines. If you know of other families that have had issues but seem to be on the other side of that, seeing what they did. But, just getting very curious and out there, because there's so much shame, and like there's a propensity to want to just not let them know my wife or my husband or my whoever is having an issue. And because of that, like some people can really stay stuck in that, and it gets worse and worse. And so, I've been pretty, I say it in a loving way, but like I've talked to moms who are like, like knowing what you know right now through all this education we just did, everything you just shared with me, your maternal instinct is want to make things as soft for your kid as possible, or whoever it might be. And it's almost malpractice as a parent. It's paradoxical, because they either you have to let them experience their bottom or try and get them help in the right way, but it's super tricky. And there's a lot of guilt that one can feel, what was my part in them going down this, divorced parents, things like that come up that can be very tricky to help someone normalize, And usually what I'll say is like, look, many people have had divorced parents. People have been through hell, torture, that don't necessarily go to alcohol or drugs. So I don't think what happened with you necessarily made so-and-so, have that issue. And you have to understand, like, that was in them. It's just manifesting right now.
Yeah. And then a different example, like myself, is I didn't have divorced parents. I didn't have any trauma when I was younger. Yeah. Definitely along the way during my addiction. But, nobody in my family with alcoholism or addiction, no obvious contributing factors other than maybe I'm just chemically a little bit different.
For sure.
I am probably more sensitive. There were things like that. But I was so grateful. My parents did not find Al-Anon until I finally got sober. But they did their own therapy, and I was in and out of rehabs, and they would come to family weeks, and they would try to learn, and they tried to hold their boundaries, and I was a manipulative little shit, like we are. I mean, I knew how to manipulate, I was like very scrappy, resourceful, but I don't know that it would have made a difference, because I was so like, I was going to do what I was going to do, and I was going to find a way to do it no matter what. And I was able to use those resources like wherever they came from.
Well, it's like you said, it and then it turns into a superpower when you get into recovery, right? Because like you have all these innate talents and gifts that now, like for me, like I'm so grateful to be in recovery, because all the stuff I went through, I was talking before we started, like the best gifts often come in poorly wrapped packages. Like my history, all that stuff I went through allows me to be here talking to you. Hopefully one person who hears this, it helps them in some way. Being able to connect with someone and have them, like I said, see the light when it goes on. It's the most beautiful thing and rewarding thing for me, but it's because it's so incredible to see that, happen. And so it is a superpower, and it's like, you'll hear people, using your evil for good, whatever. But like I had to be very savvy about when I was active. Like I would see a therapist, I would pay cash because I was nervous that the bank I worked for would somehow like it was crazy the way I was living, that's nothing compared to how crazy it was, but like just stuff like that all the time, being mindful of that. And so when you find that new way of living, that design for living that you talked about, the blueprint for life that how to get present, how to not be in constant, fear of what's going to come or shame or regret of the past, but to be here, like right now, to be able to communicate with you, and this is where we are. That is magical, and that's everything I look for in anything, in a bottle, in a pill, in a baggie, whatever. I wound up actually finding in recovery, but everyone has their own sort of journey towards that. Yeah.
I love that saying, and I've heard that sentiment in recovery, and I feel that too. I really feel like I felt everything that I was looking for in the drugs and alcohol, but also that community, that connection. I couldn't connect to other people. That was a big part of my drinking and my using, and I found that in recovery. So it's a beautiful thing. And it's not, I think one of the stigmas is that, you stop drinking or using and you're white knuckling and just fighting every day to craving and not drink and use. And, I think people do have cravings and things in the beginning, especially here and there. But for the most part, it's really about like what you're saying, like how to be mindful, how to live in the present, how to handle life on life's terms. I had a doctor on my podcast yesterday, Sue Varma. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She has a new book coming out on practical optimism.
Oh, cool.
But she used to work with people who were affected by 9/11, and she studied like stress and trauma. And a lot of her concepts, I said to her before we started recording, are very aligned with the principles of recovery and this idea of being of service to other people and having a purpose. And she said, I'm so glad that you picked up on that. Her dad was a psychiatrist who was like very involved in 12-step. He was an addiction psychiatrist. And
that's
I just
awesome.
kind of feel like, it's so like, we're so lucky that we get to have access to that. I always say, like, I don't know how normal people know how to live life. I just, like, I don't understand it because we have this design available.
For sure. And I love what you said, because I've heard the term often, you build self-esteem by doing esteemable acts, right? So there's nothing more esteemable than authentically being of service to someone, just altruistically, right? Now, for me, I've made a living out of it, so there's, I have to come to terms with that, but it is what it is. But like, I have a friend who taught me, like, once a month he goes to a restaurant and he'll pick up someone's tab, but he'll make sure the waiter does not let them know who, just little things like that to kind of, pass forward, and different ways to be of service all the time, come from a kind, loving heart, because it was me versus the world growing up, and in a very fear-based way of living. So like, talk about paradoxes, like being of service to someone, helping someone, making me feel better, helping my self-esteem, it just didn't make sense until, and so I can tell with you found the same, and that's amazing.
It's so funny, like sitting here and talking to you and looking at you, I can't reconcile like the person that's sitting in front of me and whatever you were doing before you got sober. I think it's so funny when I meet people in sobriety and they're like, I was ripping lines in Tijuana, and I'm like, this like buttoned up person sitting in front of me who just has this like lightness and presence, and I just think it's like the coolest thing.
I'm glad you didn't know me back then.
So likewise, we probably would have partied together.
I bet.
People probably think that celebrities, high net worth individuals, high functioning people have an advantage when it comes to, getting help and the resources and all of that. Do you ever find that it actually works against them because they have all these resources that they can skate by with enablers and whatnot?
So that's a great question, and absolutely, and it's really hard in a multitude of ways. But the other thing too is, like, when it's someone who's high profile or well known or of great means, they can get what special treatment, and a lot of the part of this is not I don't believe in punitive measures, but ego deflation, like ego in a clinical sense, meaning fear. And so if someone's getting special treatment, it feeds into that. And so it can very much work against someone, and it's understanding those nuances, and getting them to work with the right, even like as if I pair someone up in a treatment center with a certain clinician or therapist, psychiatrist, if they're in awe of the person, it's not going to go very well. And there can be, different things, countertransference and whatnot, where they're projecting stuff on. And by the way, some of the best treatment centers in the country are nonprofit, like amazing recovery. Yeah. But being able to have the freedom to go somewhere, and have a sense of community. If someone's really like very, very high profile and it's going to become a distraction, it is helpful sometimes to be around like-minded people in similar circumstances, so you're not feeling so judged, you know. And it can sound ostentatious like that, but the reality is so much. I know from many of the people I work with, there's a lot of what's called imposter syndrome, where if they only knew how I felt and how I thought, or that this is all a bit of a sham, and being able to identify on that level to, always feeling judged, always feeling under the microscope. And so letting their guard down can be really tricky. And so, it can be a struggle sometimes finding what's going to be the right fit. And so, everyone's a little bit different on how I approach them and what I think the right path is going to be for them. So, but it's really cool when it connects and they just let go of all that. But like I mentioned, meeting someone where they're like, my approach is I never want anyone to feel like I'm pulling them or like pushing them, but metaphorically, my arm around them, walking with them, guiding them, and letting them know it's going to be okay. But it can certainly work against, especially special treatment. And whereas here's just a quick example, like if a patient was saying that they want X, whatever it might be, some certain type of treatment or drug, and the clinician might normally say absolutely not, but no, this is so and so, like I can't say no. So there's that gut check of not wanting to have who's working with them enable them, or some fear around that, which is very real.
Precarious.
Yeah. And so for me, like part of my job is making sure that never happens, or if it does, it's quickly corrected.
So you're working with the treatment centers, the treatment teams, kind of facilitating everything, staying involved, and making sure that everything is staying on the straight and narrow. And then do you also work with the families or whoever is in their close circle? Yeah,
so that's a great question, and I neglected to mention that before. So if someone's looking for an intervention, it's so important to be with someone it's not just the intervening and getting them into treatment, but it's the ongoing engagement, working with that person and the family. I believe the number one reason why people tend to relapse, either with, drinking or drugs or even behaviorally, are because of the resentments that they have. And so it's very, very triggering. So working with the family members is as important. Oftentimes, you'll probably laugh when I say this, but oftentimes the families are way sicker than the person who needs help. Like you said, we found a solution that worked for us for a while. It got bad, and so we're now, the spotlight's on us, but they're in the same family unit. And so it's very important for that ongoing care. And I usually, interventions are probably only like 15% of what I really do. It's more ongoing. I work with some people for a long time, and I have a team, an amazing team that helps put together really good, scaffolding, especially through their first year. But that to me is critical. It's not necessary to get well, but it's a nice, it works out really well that way.
My last question, I guess, I have so many more questions, but what are people doing now? Like, I feel like I missed, this is just my own curiosity. I feel like I missed out on all like the White Claws and the rosés and the microdosing mushrooms and the edibles. And I mean, thankfully I missed out also on like the fentanyl, because I definitely would be dead right now, because I would snort anything anyone put in front of me. But it's like cocaine is back, I hear. Like what are people doing? What are people struggling with?
I don't mean to make light of this, but sometimes it's nice when it's just an alcoholic. Like, like it seems rare that's, someone's drink or drug of choice is alcohol, but it's sort of old school. There's so many different permutations. The other thing too, I don't want to sound like I'm on a pulpit, but like with the legalization of marijuana, even before the legalization of marijuana, I get a lot of people in psychosis just from weed, from marijuana. It's amazing. It's not like what it was back in the day.
Yeah.
And families from all over the world, I work, not just in the U.S., reaching out to me because the U.S., I believe, has some of the best treatment, with people in behavioral health units, aka psych wards, that all just from marijuana. So marijuana has gotten, not just they're lazy or their grades are slacking, but like really it's become much more of a hardcore drug.
Wow.
And
like probably young people too,
Yes.
like developing brains.
Yep.
Doing
Yeah.
that.
There's a family in Italy I was working with whose 17-year-old son was in a psych ward waiting for the psychosis. Like, there's no history of substance abuse in the family or mental health issues. This kid was doing the most intense way for like over a year, and something just snapped. So that's become pervasive. But yeah, I see it all. Like you mentioned, it seems like, cocaine's a little bit on the rise. Opiates, I too, I thank God I'm in recovery because, I don't say this lightly, there's no way I would be alive, like with what I'm seeing with fentanyl and everything. It's when you're in that mindset, you're not so discerning,
No, very nice way of putting it.
Yeah. So I think, to answer, I'm seeing a lot of different things, but the thing that's most, oddly enough, something that seems so harmless growing up has become really, egregious with a lot, and it leads to other things too. But so yeah, and then ketamine's become very popular, and it's such a dangerous
even in
drug.
Sobriety too, though, right? People using it for depression.
Yep.
I don't mean to like air quote depression, but even when I got sober, I remember when I was in sober living, there were people doing like the ketamine nasal spray from their
lollipops.
doctors, which I don't know enough about it to have an opinion on it, but it's maybe.
Well, I'd say if you have an issue with addiction and if ketamine's been a part of your past, especially, but even if not, there's a good chance that you might become susceptible to that. You'll hear the term like an allergy, whether it comes to alcohol, drugs, and all an allergy means is an abnormal reaction to something going in your body. So like if I was allergic to eating peanuts, and I ate peanuts, I'd have that reaction. The allergy referred to in addiction really is more like you mentioned, the inability to turn on the off switch or whatever, flip the switch. And so when you get triggered or that's in your system, and it's very effective at first, it's seductive, and then next thing you know, you're down this rabbit hole and you hear story after story. And so so there's, like I mentioned, a myriad of different things going on that I'm exposed to. Nothing, I shouldn't say nothing seems to surprise me, but like it's amazing what comes across, and who's doing what is kind of surprising too sometimes. But it's just, again, someone who's in emotional distress or pain or trying to relieve whatever's going on with them, trauma, looking for whatever is going to be that fix, that painkiller to quiet that down. And so whatever it is. It's
like an attempt at self-regulation.
For sure. They're self-medicating. People, and that's the thing with the stigma that bothers me, that thank God it's lifting a little bit, but people are hurting. They're you hear the term sick and suffering, but they're really just wounded, right? And no one is choosing to live that way. Not me, not you. We were wounded, and we needed to get well, and we needed healing. And so if you're coming across it as like willpower or shame on you, I mean, all you're doing is most likely going to make them feel worse about themselves, and ironically do more of what's harming them. So it's so important, I believe, to come from that loving approach when you're meeting with someone who has issues with this.
Fascinating. Well, I think what you do is so interesting and so important, and I could talk about this for hours, but we're out of time. So tell everybody where they can find you.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I'll give my direct cell phone number. I don't mind. Yeah. So I mean, we have an 800 number. My company is called Sterling Recovery Services. But if you want to reach me in particular, my cell phone is 917-653-3899, and I'm more than happy to help, even consult, point you in the right direction, whatever I can do to be of service. So again, 917-653-3899. That's
first time anyone's done that on the show.
Yeah,
Love that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you.